So, about a month or so ago, the second attempt at adapting Avatar: The Last Airbender to a live action, this time by Netflix, concluded its first season. And now it's time for me to also conclude my own judgment on the show. From the very solemn flashbacks of various characters, the dynamic heat between Fire Nation royals, the hardships of people in the Earth Kingdom from commoner and soldier to even royalty, to a frigid and watered-down attempt at portraying the Northern Water Tribe, pun intended, anyway, among many other interesting changes, both working for and against the show. Today, fellow mind, we look at the good, the mid, and the bad of Netflix's Avatar live adaptation, and finally, after multiple episode reviews and analyses, allow me to share my own final thoughts here in my mind. But before anything else, let's get these out of the way first. The settings never failed to impress in this live action. I might even make a dedicated video appreciating the vast improvements on setting design and architecture by this new adaptation. Also, the bending was definitely good, though it was at times a bit impotent, especially with some common earthbending guards and soldiers, but that might be explained away simply by them just being less skilled benders. So as I watched the show, aside from the spectacle of the settings and the clothing, the dialogue stood out to me in, let's say, more ways than one. Is it just me, or did a lot of the conversations meant to convey certain messages to the viewer about the world were too wordy and took way too long, and could have probably been made more concise? Let me bring forth some examples and compare them to the original show. So I can't show all the scenes I noticed, so I picked out several ones that showcased this very wordy dialogue and that really stood out to me while I was watching the adaptation. And this first example really made me notice how excessively lengthy the dialogue is sometimes. After Aang's realization of how long he was frozen for, he and Katara started chatting about various things that happened and are happening currently in the world. From the Fire Nation's attacks causing her to be the last Southern Waterbender, the isolation of the nations and the ships that were stopped by her ancestors, their father leaving and Sokka being left in charge, and then Aang just telling the viewer explicitly the subtle messaging of the very conversation they're having, among other things. Though I actually did like that there were multiple ships instead of just the one, as this would demonstrate the many battles waged in the south. This conversation was a big information dump, and to me at least was a bit forced, as this dialogue seemed the most obviously written for conveying information to the viewer rather than the viewer learning through a natural conversation between characters like in the original show. This one struck me as being clearly made for the viewer, not to mention how very long it took for them to converse. Meanwhile, most of this information was conveyed with a few words and occurred as more natural topics between characters in the original show. When Katara's bending was brought up in the original show, it naturally transitioned to her mentioning that she was the only one left in the south, and thus also mentioning later on the Fire Navy ship that attacked her people before. This comparison is actually one that exemplifies this criticism of the adaptation so well. Notice how very on the nose and overly worded the conversation was, not to mention how somewhat abrupt it was between the characters. While the original had a very natural dialogue between the characters and interaction, and with fewer words conveyed the same message. We again see this too on-the-nose bland dialogue when the gang was welcomed by the Northern Water Tribe chief, just explicitly stating who he is and his daughter and then Master Pak. While the original show mixed both showing and telling, demonstrating Master Paku's skills through performance while insinuating he is the master, positioning Arnook as the Water Tribe chief as he gives his speech to his tribe, and Yue presented as this regal and important figure. There are other examples of the adaptation being too on the nose and wordy with its conveying of exposition to the viewer. The Iroh and Aang interactions, too wordy, too much stuff being said, Yue explaining in detail why the spirits take physical form and again explaining stuff about Kuruk. Which leads me actually into my second critique, delivery of lines. Now, how lines are delivered is in fact a mixed bag. The cadence is a hit or miss in this show, in this adaptation, but one clear miss is exemplified in the latter episodes, in particular here with a very particular character's performance. Though the Yue sacrifice info dump on the spirits could have been remedied by giving it its own particular scenes, but the scene where Yue and Aang talk in front of Kuruk's statue could have only frankly been saved with a better cadence, better performance, or frankly better written dialogue about what she said. Hear how utterly casual the tone of Yue's voice is. It seems a bit out of place, lacking any gravity that would infer to Aang the nuanced life and message he has to learn from Kuruk. Instead, it's just a weird casual conversation, and the dialogue being again too detailed did not help. Yue could have conveyed to Aang the nuance of what Kuruk did better than just blandly literally stating that she thinks there's more to it. And don't even get me started on what they made Roku speak like. We'll get to him later. As much as there were many questionable dialogues in this show, and I only covered the ones that truly stood out to me, there were also very good uses and very effective dialogue in this adaptation. To mention briefly, the Air Nomad Council was a very nice display of actual arguments by council members on why Aang should be sent away, and why telling him too soon may also be a mistake. The Fire Nation opening scenes and generally all Fire Nation royal dialogue, except for the Iroh and Aang ones, were handled very well. The gravity in Ozai's voice, the cunningness of Azula, the annoyed, dedicated fury from Zuko, and at times even Iroh's own cadence held up very well, and even Sozin's maliciousness. Even their take on Commander Zhao delivered his lines very well. And so many examples, especially in the early episodes with Gyatso or Mashu characters. Though Bumi did suffer a bit at the hallway scene, it seemed a bit too rushed for me. The dialogue quality was a really mixed bag, but credit where it is due, but also debit where it is clearly needed more. Okay, so aside from the dialogue having weak and strong deliveries, we now judge the characters as portrayed in this adaptation, starting with the good. They really did nail the Cabbage Man. I think it's actually the same actor. Anyway, aside from the Cabbage Man being a solid 10 out of 10, by the gods did this show really nail the portrayal of the royal members of the Fire Nation. Costume and looks, spot on. Needs its own video, to be honest. Ozai really looks intimidating. His dialogue, his speeches, his cadence, very impactful, and the subtle writing of his manipulations was quite well done. I initially was skeptical of them making Ozai a grayer character here, as he actually seems to actually care for his children and to some extent Iroh, rather than being a complete Machiavellian psycho. But they actually portrayed it well without losing any of the character's potency, it seems. Going to the royal siblings, I'd say Azula was decent actually. Really like how she fooled those rebels. Really shows her cunning and manipulation tactics. But seems this performance is a bit more childish, which does actually make sense since this actor is an actual teenager, an actual child, so she will really lose some of that potency that an adult could usually bring and portray. Zuko, however, I think was very spot on, very solid, if not improved actually, given so many details like him collecting Avatar relics and lore, really showing his dedication also through his voice. I would say a really solid portrayal on Zuko. And to mention, Sozin himself was as intimidating and cruel as would be appropriate of his character. Showing his brilliance in strategy was really good. A clever ruse indeed, Fire Lord. He was portrayed as the man he was, sadistically brilliant. The royals of the Fire Nation were indeed largely solid in their portrayal. However, Gyatso was also done pretty well. His interactions with Aang were very sincere and impactful. They really portrayed him as Aang's father figure very well. There were other characters that I found to be very solid in their portrayal, but this might take a bit too long. I'll just mention them a bit. Suki's mom was very solid for her role, a very nice change actually. Gran, Jin, the Mechanist, Kurok and Kyoshi were actually very nice portrayals of past avatars, and even Lieutenant G was a very nice character. Okay, I want firstly to remind people that mid literally means middle. It doesn't mean bad, it means it's not that problematic, even teetering on good sometimes, or at worst, just barely dismissible. So notice how I missed one member of the royal family. Yes, unfortunately, Iroh was quite mid in this show, but I would say he is on the higher end of that. But he is somewhat lacking in his portrayal and how he was written. I did not get enough of that wisdom from him and the subtle noddings in the original show to his true prowess as a person. He was portrayed more as a broken man here in this adaptation who tries so much for Zuko, which may have compromised somewhat his quality as a character, though nothing really wrong here. The focus on his character was just a bit shifted. Admiral Zhao, again a very decent portrayal. They really changed this character more, but they portrayed this change well in my opinion. He was more mischievous here rather than the intimidating schemer in the original show. But yes, quite a decent character. Also how he continuously outwits Zuko was really a nice touch to his new character. Now, about Suki. To be frank, she is mid but honestly teetering on bad. Her character was a bit diminished from a more nuanced and dynamic story with Sokka to this very typical local girl meets odd foreign guy kind of trope. Suki's fine but quite lacking, frankly. Now, Boomy went from mad genius to crazy king. Conceptually, this could have worked, however, again, with other things, the execution of this concept was a bit rushed and not effective, especially in the hallway scene. It was basically a very abridged version of the games Boomy and Aang had in the original show, and the very odd and very, quite frankly, abridged dialogue did not help either. It felt very forced and, just sudden. However, the scenes Boomy was in were very mixed. I did like his dialogue during his fight and feasting scenes with Aang, so I would say he is almost a true mid. Jet was also fine. I put him in mid because I'm not sure what I feel about him. He wasn't that noteworthy to me, but I will mention given his acting, writing, and interactions, he is on the high end of mid. And you might hate this, but the gang were not that solid to me. But again, they are fine, a little above solid mid to be honest. The gang, especially given the whole season, were a hit or miss however. Many things were changed. I personally don't think they're handling Sokka's development well, but his performance was great actually, the actor. Even as he interacted with Yue, he was still portraying the character very well, even when Yue herself was very iffy. They also handled Katara a bit odd. She had a way more impactful flashback, yes, but her development here in this adaptation to becoming a master did not make any sense. She was a novice at the beginning, got advice from Aang, and the only waterbending scroll in the south they managed to keep, which probably means that the southern waterbending that they have is incomplete. To suddenly, without any formal training and access to more waterbending scrolls and literature, let alone a proper master, she then suddenly becomes Master Katara.
What? I'm not a...
Okay, on to Aang. He was actually fine in his performance, though his writing, it's just not hitting me the same way as the original. He is an okay guy, but I feel this portrayal is a bit bland. I don't know. I'm still trying to really put my finger on it, but he is a very, very decent Aang. Okay, let's start with something more annoying rather than frustrating. So in my last review of the finale of Avatar, I talked about multiple scenes with the Northern Water Tribe characters, and basically they were very, 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 and I mean very clearly inferior compared to their original show counterparts. I was thinking of placing Paku in mid, because I think he did have good lines, especially when talking to Katara, expressing his wisdom about waterbending in the dining hall, and his dialogue again in the planning room were quite good actually, but his overall writing is just very underwhelming, and his performance is frankly not that good enough to save him. We don't see him fighting in the battle like in the original show, and he then declares Katara a master without any training at all.
Better master.
And we have the royal family of the Northern Water Tribe. Bland, bland, bland. In the previous review analysis, I compared the introduction of the North's characters seen in the original show and in this adaptation, and the show just really did it better than the half-hearted, cheesy, too-on-the-nose naming by Chief Arnook in this adaptation. And Yue, as mentioned in my criticism of the dialogue, just keeps saying so much stuff. And to be honest, her delivery lacks the proper cadence and emotions in many, many cases. Too on the nose and very casually spoken. Wan Shi Tong was rushed, just plopped in as a reference, and the whole fire temple was just plopped in the middle as well. The fire sages were just there, I guess, and what is very, very sad and worst is Roku wasn't even here. We just got some cheap-looking silly old man in a costume.
Forgive me! I couldn't resist. It's good to see you, Aang.
Look how they massacred my boy.
In all honesty, it could have worked. But again, the execution was just laughable. They made Roku some sort of joke and no one laughed. I'll make a dedicated video on why Roku didn't work, but for now let's move on to other matters that are less depressing. Okay, I'll just focus on particular plot changes that were most crucial. If we cover them all, this video might take hours. So firstly, I really do love how the adaptation did the flashbacks, expanding on and portraying the details of past events with more emotional impact. The whole first scenes of the entire season in the first episode were amazing at portraying the cunning and brilliance of the Air Nomad genocide, and also the great sadness of it. Katara's mother's sacrifice was more emotionally impactful. The scream was truly heartfelt. Even when Aang was reminiscing and remembering Gyatso at the Southern Air Temple in the Avatar state, all these made me truly weep. And especially the small change to Zuko's flashback and backstory, making his crew the very division of soldiers he saved in that very war meeting that got him banished, was a great touch to his dynamic with his own crew. Again, another very heartfelt scene. It really gives more depth to Zuko's character, and we all experience this through Lieutenant G's epiphany, which is such brilliant writing. I wish this level of writing was consistent throughout the show. Shame. Sokka's engineering was a nice touch as well, showing his diverse skill set, and Gran revealing the scroll to Katara was also a nice subtle change. Another very nice change, however, were the dynamics of the Fire Nation royals. Having them interact with each other gave a more vivid sense of who they are and what motivates them. And it's such a nice thing to finally see Iroh and Ozai interact, since in the original they never even spoke to each other in any scene at all. Even though Ozai doesn't seem to really despise Iroh and actually seems to treat him like a brother, somehow this didn't take away from his character for me. Really nice how they managed to change Ozai without compromising him. Effort in both writing and acting here is on point. And Ozai pushing his children was also a nice touch to show the intensity of the Fire Nation and how this shaped Zuko and Azula. Another change that was really nice was clearly explaining why the spirits became fish. Though how it was explained, the delivery, the execution of this did fail, I think conceptually it was very solid. And on a last note, the way Kyoshi Island concluded made more sense than in the original show, which was very nice as well. They actually did Zhao's ascension through the ranks somewhat better here, as we clearly see how he did it rather than the very convenient promotions he got throughout the original show, though he was still less intimidating here, which hampered his character a bit. Bumi going insane was actually a nice concept, just executed somewhat poorly. The scenes that showed his deranged mentality were really a hit or miss. Though I still prefer his wiser version in the original. Master Paku not being convinced by the necklace was also an improvement, but was a very underdeveloped arc. Now to the horrible changes. The spirit world was incredibly rushed and the writing was frankly just horrendous. The only thing good about it were the flashbacks the gang had in the spirit world, and frankly only Katara's really struck me. And what was supposed to be an intense and crucial part in the original, the Fire Temple arc, was just so squeezed and plopped out of nowhere in this adaptation. Shame, truly a shame. Having a direct prophecy direct the journey of Season 1 was unfortunate, as it somewhat cheapened the incentives of the characters to start the journey and why they were headed to the north, rather than the original show where the incentives for why the gang left for the north were developed through interactions with each other and getting to know their aspirations as characters, really painting them as a band of friends on an adventure. This is not equivalent to Roku in the original directly telling Aang about the comet, as that came later in the show and is the overarching drive of the gang's adventure, but the little details of their personal motivations were a depth of story detail that makes the show less bland, as you had the overarching motivation of the comet and also the individual drives and factors that paint each character. And lastly, I really did not understand why the knife was needed to kill the fish, since it was established by Yue that the spirits are very much mortal and are risking a real death, which is the whole point of why they become mortal every whatever moon it was. They trade temporarily their immortality for the risk of a real death. Because if they didn't really have the risk of really dying, then there wouldn't be any point into turning into the fish then. So why the knife? This adaptation by Netflix had a lot of conceptually good stuff going for it. However, the execution and the delivery of some of these concepts and changes were just frankly poorly done, or at least lacking. But the show, especially towards the end, had a lot of clearly objectionable or at least questionable changes. Now, anything I did not mention in this already somewhat extensive video were either very minor changes that were mid at best or dismissible at worst. But do not get me wrong, this show had a lot of stuff it made better, frankly, than the original show. As I mentioned throughout the video, this season did indeed start strong, however had a clear quality drop towards the end. And with all of this in mind, I declared the Avatar Netflix adaptation to be neither overtly bad nor solidly good, but rather a true mid. But those were my thoughts. What about your own? Do freely Share them below. May our minds meet again soon. You are always welcome here in my mind.